Some men spend their entire lives searching for something they can't name. Ethan Cross had stopped searching 3 years ago. Now he just existed, moving through days that blurred together like fence posts seen from a galloping horse. Each morning brought the same hollow routine in a house that had once held laughter and warmth, but now held only echoes. The winter of 1918 pressed cold against the windows of his Montana ranch house. Outside, snow fell in thick curtains that obscured the distant mountains. Inside, firelight painted dancing shadows across walls that remembered better days. Ethan Cross sat in his rocking chair near the hearth, hands trembling slightly with age, watching flames consume split pine logs the way fire had once consumed everything he loved. He was 78 years old now. The mirror showed him a stranger with white hair and weathered skin, but his eyes still held the sharpness of a man who'd learned to read danger in the tilt of a horse's ear or the way shadows fell across a canyon wall. Those eyes had seen things most men couldn't imagine. They'd witnessed loss that carved itself so deep into a man's soul, it changed the very shape of who he was. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a photograph in a simple wooden frame. The image had faded to sepia tones over the decades, but he could still make out every detail. A woman in traditional Apache dress stood tall and proud, dark hair braided tight against her skull, eyes that seemed to pierce through the camera lens and see straight into the photographer's heart. Naira Blackfeather. The name still brought warmth to his chest after all these years. His grandson Thomas sat cross-legged on the floor near his feet, 12 years old and full of the kind of curiosity that couldn't be satisfied with simple answers. The boy had been asking questions all evening, circling around something he had heard whispered in town, too afraid to ask directly until the weight of not knowing became heavier than the fear of what the answer might be. Finally, as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Thomas found his courage. "Grandpa," the boy said, voice small in the large room, "people in town say you lived with Indians, with a whole tribe of them. Is that true?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire consume wood the way time consumed memory. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades, rough as river stones, worn smooth by constant current. "That's not quite how the story begins, son. It starts with loss, with death, with a man who'd grown so tired of living that dying seemed like it might be a mercy." Thomas leaned forward, eyes wide. Outside, wind rattled the windows like ghostly hands seeking entry. "In the spring of 1878, when I was 38 years old, I followed the tracks of 4 stolen horses into a land everyone called Widow's Canyon. They said it was a place where men who entered never came back. And I knew that. I knew it with the same certainty I knew my own name. But I went anyway." The old man's eyes grew distant, seeing not the fire before him, but another fire, decades past, that had taken everything that mattered. His voice dropped lower, pulling the boy into a story that had waited 40 years to be told. "Because you see, Thomas, by then I'd already lost everything that made life worth living. And a man with nothing left to lose becomes dangerous in ways he never intended. Not dangerous to others, but dangerous to himself. Reckless, willing to walk into places that promised death because death and life had started to look pretty much the same." The firelight caught the moisture gathering in the old man's eyes. He blinked it away, took a breath that rattled slightly in his chest, and let the memories flood back. Let himself remember the spring of 1878, when he'd been a different man entirely. A broken man, a man who'd buried his heart in Montana soil and spent 3 years forgetting how to feel anything except the dull ache of absence. "Let me tell you how it really started," Ethan said. "Let me tell you about the morning I found those horses missing, and the choice I made that changed everything." The scene shifted in his mind, clear as if 40 years hadn't passed at all. He could smell the coffee brewing, feel the cold of early mornings seeping through the walls, see the empty chairs at his kitchen table like accusatory witnesses to his failure. It had been a Tuesday. He remembered that detail for no good reason, except that the human mind clings to strange specifics when everything else blurs together. Tuesday morning, April 16th, 1878. The sun rose red over the eastern ridge, painting the clouds the color of old blood. Some men might have taken that as an omen. Ethan Cross had stopped believing in omens the day he pulled his wife and daughter from the ashes of their home. He woke as he always did, alone in a bed too large for one person. The house settled around him with creaks and groans, wood contracting as morning temperatures rose. He dressed in the same clothes he had worn for 3 days because laundry required effort he couldn't summon. His reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin showed a man aging faster than his years, lines carved deep around eyes that had forgotten how to look at the world with anything except dull acceptance. The kitchen routine played out like a ritual performed by a man who'd forgotten why the ritual mattered. He built a fire in the Monarch stove, a model from 1875 that Margaret had been so proud of when they'd scraped together the money to buy it. The cast iron was cold under his calloused hands. He filled the kettle from the bucket by the door. Water he'd hauled from the creek the evening before because the well had gone dry and he hadn't found the will to dig it deeper. The kettle went on the stove. The coffee tin came down from the shelf. Arbuckle's Ariosa, the kind every rancher in Montana Territory bought because it was cheap and strong and got the job done. 25 cents a pound, though prices were rising as the railroad pushed farther west. He measured out grounds with the practiced economy of a man who lived alone and had learned to make supplies stretch. While the coffee brewed, he stood at the window and looked out at land he'd claimed under the Homestead Act of 1862. 160 acres that he'd worked for 8 years, improving it with sweat and hope and the kind of stubborn determination that the frontier demanded. The land was worth something now. Maybe $1,200 if he could find a buyer, but money couldn't buy back what he'd lost here. His eyes went, as they always did, to the corner of the property where 2 wooden crosses stood stark against the morning sky. He'd carved them himself from oak, the good hardwood that would last decades. Margaret Cross, born 1846, died 1875. Beloved wife. Lily Cross, born 1868, died 1875. Beloved daughter. The words were few because grief had made him economical with language the way poverty made men economical with money. 3 years. It had been 3 years since the day the kitchen hearth had thrown a spark into the dry tinder Margaret kept for kindling. 3 years since he'd been in the far pasture, a mile away, mending fence and cursing the work that took him from home. 3 years since he'd looked up and seen smoke rising black and terrible against the blue Montana sky. The memory came whether he wanted it or not. It always did when he stood at this window. He saw himself younger, stronger, riding his horse at a gallop that nearly killed the animal. Saw himself reaching the house with flames already consuming the roof, heat so intense it pushed him back when he tried the door. He tried anyway, tried until his hands blistered and his eyebrows singed and his lungs filled with smoke that made him cough blood for a week after. The neighbors had come, the Johnsons from the next property over, alerted by the smoke column visible for miles. They'd held him down while he screamed and fought and watched his whole world collapse into ash and ember. They'd held him all through that terrible afternoon, and then they'd helped him dig through the wreckage the next morning when the ruins were cool enough to approach. He'd found them in what had been the bedroom, huddled together. Margaret must have grabbed Lily and tried to find safety there, away from the kitchen where the fire started. They died together, mother and daughter, from the smoke probably, quick and merciful if there was any mercy to be found in such things. He told himself that, had told himself that every day for 3 years. Sometimes he almost believed it. The coffee boiled over, hissing on the hot stovetop, pulling him back to the present. He poured a cup with hands that had steadied over the years, muscle memory taking over where thought failed. The coffee was too strong, bitter as regret, but he drank it anyway because it was warm and it was routine, and routine was all that kept a man moving forward when he'd forgotten why forward mattered. He sat at the table. 3 chairs stood empty, accusatory in their vacancy. Once this table had held conversation and laughter, Margaret's hands busy with sewing while Lily practiced her letters on a slate board. Now it held only his single cup, steam rising like the ghost of better days. The coffee tasted like ash. Everything tasted like ash. He was halfway through the cup when he noticed something was wrong. The wrongness came to him slowly, the way things do to a man whose mind has grown accustomed to moving through fog. He looked out the window toward the southern pasture where he kept his horses and counted. 4 missing. Not all of them. He still had 6 in sight, grazing peacefully in the early light. But 4 were gone, and their absence gnawed at him with the insistence of a splinter working its way deeper into flesh. Ethan set down his coffee cup and walked outside without bothering to grab his coat. The morning air was cold enough to sting his lungs, sharp with the last bite of winter that hadn't quite released its grip on the high country. His breath clouded white in front of his face as he made his way to the pasture fence. The tracks were there, clear as printed words for a man who knew how to read them. 4 sets of hoof prints leading northwest, away from his property and toward land that made most men nervous. The tracks were light, deliberate, showing control and understanding. Whoever had taken his horses knew animals, knew how to move them quietly, knew how to choose which ones to take and which to leave. That last detail bothered him more than the theft itself. A simple rustler would have taken all 10 horses, driven them hard toward the nearest railroad town, where they could be sold, no questions asked. But this, taking exactly 4, chosen with care, moved with precision, that spoke of purpose. The tracks led northwest, toward Widow's Canyon. Everyone in the territory knew about Widow's Canyon, knew it the way children know about the dark places under their beds, with a mixture of fear and terrible curiosity. It was Apache land, or had been before the treaties that weren't worth the paper they were printed on. Now it existed in a strange limbo, too remote for settlers to bother with, too dangerous for the cavalry to patrol regularly. Men who went into Widow's Canyon didn't come back. That was the simple truth that everyone accepted without much discussion. Every few months, some fool would go in looking for something. Lost cattle, a claimed mine that probably didn't exist. Sometimes just looking for trouble, because young men often went looking for trouble before life taught them better. They didn't come back. Marshal William Kane had tried twice to organize expeditions into the canyon. Both times his men had refused once they got close enough to see the entrance, that narrow cut in the rock that seemed to swallow light and sound. The marshal himself had made noises about federal authority and the need to establish law. But when the governor's office in Virginia City told him to leave well enough alone, he'd been happy to oblige. Now Ethan Cross stood looking at tracks that led directly toward that forbidden territory and felt something stir in his chest that might have been anger, or might have been something else entirely. He tried to remember the last time he'd felt anything strongly enough to name it, and couldn't. The smart thing would be to ride into town, file a report with Marshal Kane, let the proper authorities handle it. That's what a sensible man would do, a man who valued his life and his property in that order. But Ethan Cross had stopped being sensible the day he'd buried his family. And as for valuing his life, he turned that thought over in his mind like a man examining a stone for flaws. His life. What was it worth, really? What was it for? He had no family. No friends close enough to notice if he disappeared. No purpose that couldn't be fulfilled by someone else willing to work the land. He was 38 years old and already felt ancient, worn down by grief that had settled into his bones like winter cold that never quite thawed. The truth was simple and terrible. Dying alone in Widow's Canyon, or dying alone in this empty house 6 months from now, amounted to the same destination. The only difference was the scenery along the way. The thought should have frightened him. Instead, it brought something almost like relief. A decision made. A path chosen. He would follow the tracks. He would go into the canyon. He would retrieve his property, or he would die trying. And either outcome felt acceptable in a way that another day of coffee and empty chairs did not. He went back inside and packed with the methodical efficiency of a man who'd spent years on the frontier. 2 days of supplies, no more. Salt pork and hardtack that would keep. Jerky he'd made himself the previous fall when he'd actually cared enough to think about winter provisions. A canteen filled with creek water, boiled and cooled. His rifle, a Winchester Model 1873 and 44-40 caliber, the kind of gun every rancher owned because it was reliable and parts were easy to find. He checked the rifle's action, made sure the magazine held 14 rounds plus 1 in the chamber. 15 chances to hit what he aimed at. Probably more than he'd need for whatever waited in the canyon, but men who went unprepared tended to end up as cautionary tales. His knife went on his belt. A Bowie with a 9-inch blade, well-maintained, sharp enough to shave with, though he hadn't bothered to shave in a week. Extra ammunition in his saddlebag. A bedroll in case he ended up sleeping rough. Matches wrapped in oilcloth to keep them dry. He looked around the house one last time before leaving. Tried to feel something about the possibility that he might not see it again. The emptiness that answered told him everything he needed to know about why he was really doing this. His horse Steel waited in the small stable, a gray gelding that had been his only real companion for the past year. The animal nickered softly as Ethan approached, hopeful for oats or an apple. Ethan gave him both, took time to curry the horse's coat and check his hooves, even though it would have been faster to just saddle up and ride. Some habits died hard. Some pieces of who he'd been before refused to let go completely. "We're going on a ride, old friend," Ethan told the horse, his voice rusty from disuse. He spoke to Steel more than he spoke to people these days. The horse didn't expect answers or offer sympathy. He just listened with patient equine acceptance and did the work asked of him. He saddled Steel carefully, checked the cinch twice, made sure the bedroll was secure and the saddlebags balanced. The kind of preparation a man did when he cared about doing things right, even if he didn't much care about the outcome. The sun had climbed higher by the time he rode out, following the tracks northwest. The morning had warmed slightly, but still carried the sharp edge of spring at altitude. His breath and the horse's breath both clouded white in the air. The land stretched out around him in rolling hills covered with new grass and scattered pine, beautiful in the way that Montana was always beautiful, indifferent to human suffering. He followed the tracks through country he knew well for the first few hours. Past the Johnson place where smoke rose from the chimney and children played in the yard. Past the old Henriksen claim that had been abandoned 2 winters back when the family gave up and moved to Oregon. Past markers he recognized, landmarks that mapped his small world. Then into country that grew less familiar with each mile. The hills steepened, the trees grew thicker. The sky seemed farther away somehow, pressed down by canyon walls that rose on either side of the trail. He'd been this way once or twice before, hunting elk in the high country, but never this far, never close enough to see where the canyon really began. The tracks remained clear, easy to follow. Too easy, maybe. The thought occurred to him that he might be meant to follow them, that this might be less theft and more invitation. But invitation to what? And why him specifically? He had no answers, so he kept riding. Steel grew nervous as they went deeper into the canyonlands. The horse's ears kept flicking backward, nostrils flaring at scents Ethan couldn't detect. Animals knew things men didn't. They felt danger in the air, like approaching weather, some instinct that civilization had trained out of humans, but remained sharp in creatures whose lives depended on reading warning signs. "Easy, boy," Ethan murmured, patting the horse's neck. "We're almost there." Wherever there was, the first warning sign appeared tied to a branch at eye level, a piece of red fabric faded by sun and weather but placed deliberately where someone following this trail couldn't miss it. Not a warning exactly, more like a marker, a promise. "You've come this far," it seemed to say. "Are you sure you want to keep going?" Ethan rode past it without slowing. The second marker came a mile later, another strip of cloth, this one with beadwork that identified it clearly as Apache. The pattern meant something, probably carried some message he couldn't read because he'd never learned the language of symbols and colors. He knew enough to recognize it was deliberate, intentional. They wanted him to find these markers. They wanted him to know he was being led somewhere. The canyon narrowed as afternoon shadows grew long. The walls closed in on either side, red stone that rose hundreds of feet into air that tasted different somehow. Metallic, sharp, the kind of air that came before storms except the sky remained clear overhead, visible only as a ribbon of blue between the canyon walls. Sound behaved strangely here. Steel's hoofbeats echoed wrong, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. When a bird called from somewhere above, the cry bounced and multiplied until it was impossible to tell where it had originated. This was a place that swallowed noise and twisted it, sent it back, distorted. This was a place men avoided for good reason. Ethan's every instinct screamed at him to turn back. The primitive part of his brain that had kept his ancestors alive through millennia of dangers both real and imagined was firing warning signals like telegraph messages. Danger, trap, death ahead. Turn around while you still can. But he'd stopped listening to the part of himself that wanted to survive 3 years ago when he'd pulled bodies from ashes. That part had died in the fire along with everything else that mattered. What rode forward now was just the husk, animated by habit and momentum and the faint hope that maybe oblivion waited somewhere ahead. He found the old campsite just as the sun touched the canyon rim. Someone had been here recently, within the last few days. The fire pit still held charcoal that crumbled when he touched it, but hadn't yet been scattered by wind. A cleared space where bedrolls had lain, the distinctive mark of a coffee pot and dust near the fire ring. And on a rock beside the fire pit, placed where it couldn't be missed, a woman's hair tie. Beaded leather worked with intricate patterns, beautiful in its craftsmanship. Patchy work, undeniably. Left here deliberately for him to find. Ethan picked it up, turned it over in his hands. The beads caught the fading light, deep blues and reds that spoke of hours of patient labor. Someone had made this with care, worn it with pride, and left it here as a message. They wanted him to know, wanted him to understand that this wasn't random theft or coincidence. This was planned, purposeful. He was being led to something, and whoever was leading him wanted to make sure he knew it before he arrived. The smart move would be to turn back, right now while he still could, before whatever waited ahead could spring whatever trap had been so carefully laid. Ethan mounted steel and rode deeper into the canyon. Darkness fell quickly once the sun dropped below the canyon rim. The temperature plummeted with it, that sudden cold that came to high desert country when the sun's warmth vanished. Ethan made camp in a hollow off the trail, built a small fire for warmth more than cooking. He wasn't hungry anyway. He sat with his back against a boulder, rifle across his lap, and watched shadows dance at the edge of firelight. This might be his last night alive. The thought should have brought fear, or at least some emotional response. Instead, he felt only a distant curiosity about what morning would bring. Steele stood hobbled nearby, calm now that they'd stopped moving. The horse dozed standing up the way horses did, one hip cocked, trusting his rider to keep watch for dangers. Some trust was misplaced. Ethan Cross couldn't keep anyone safe. History had proven that beyond doubt. He thought about Margaret. Not the Margaret who died, but the one who'd lived. The woman he'd courted for 6 months before convincing her to marry a rough rancher with more dreams than money. She'd been a school teacher in Virginia City, educated, refined, beautiful in a way that seemed impossible for someone like him to deserve. Their wedding had been simple, conducted by a traveling preacher who passed through twice a year. She'd worn a dress she'd sewn herself, pale blue like a Montana summer sky. He'd worn his best clothes and felt like an imposter in them, a rough man playing at being civilized. 5 years of marriage. Not long by some measures, but they'd packed a lifetime of love into those years. Lily had come along the second year, a daughter with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn chin. Perfect in every way that mattered. They'd had plans to expand the ranch, plans to build a bigger house, plans for more children and growing old together, watching their grandchildren play, plans that burned to nothing in an afternoon, gone before he'd even known they were at risk. The fire burned down to coals. Ethan added another branch and watched sparks spiral upward into darkness. Above, stars appeared in the ribbon of sky, visible between canyon walls. So many and so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The same stars Margaret had loved to watch on summer nights, when the three of them would lie on a blanket outside, and she'd point out constellations, making up stories about them to entertain Lily. He'd never learned the proper names of most of those stars. Now no one was left to teach him. Sleep came eventually, fitful and full of dreams he wouldn't remember come morning. He woke before dawn to find frost coating his bedroll and Steele stamping nervously, ears pricked forward at something in the darkness beyond the dead fire. They came at first light. The arrow struck the ground 3 inches from his left boot, embedding itself in hard earth with a thud that seemed impossibly loud in the canyon's strange acoustics. Ethan's hand moved toward his rifle by pure instinct. Years of frontier living where hesitation meant death. But he stopped the motion halfway, raised his hands instead, slow and deliberate, because he'd already seen them. They emerged from positions he should have spotted but somehow missed, from behind rocks that hadn't seemed large enough to hide a person, from shadows that didn't have the depth to conceal a human body, from the canyon walls themselves, it seemed, flowing down with the coordinated grace of predators who'd practiced this maneuver until it became as natural as breathing. Women, at least 20 of them, maybe more. It was hard to count when they kept moving, surrounding him in an ever-tightening circle that cut off every avenue of escape. They wore traditional Apache dress modified for practical movement, leather and cloth in earth tones that let them blend with the canyon environment. Some carried bows with arrows nocked and ready. Others held blades that caught the early light and promised swift death to anyone foolish enough to resist. One woman, older than the others, held a rifle that looked ancient, but was probably maintained well enough to fire true. Their faces showed no fear, no hesitation, only cold evaluation, the look of hunters who'd found their prey exactly where they expected it and now assessed the best way to proceed with the kill. But it was their leader who made Ethan's breath catch in his chest. She moved through the others like water finding its path of least resistance. Every warrior stepped aside without being asked, creating an opening that closed behind her as she passed. Tall, dark hair braided tight against her skull in a warrior style. Scars marked her arms, her neck, her face, each one a story written in healed flesh. The kind of scars Ethan recognized because he carried similar ones under his shirt. The marks of violence survived, of pain endured. She stopped 10 feet from him, studying him with eyes that seemed to see through skin and bone, straight to whatever rotted underneath. Her expression gave away nothing. No anger, no curiosity, just assessment, weighing him against some internal standard he couldn't begin to guess at. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no trace of the accent Ethan had expected. Her English was perfect, clear, cold as winter water straight from a mountain spring. "You followed those horses a long way for a man who rides alone." Ethan held her gaze, keeping his hands visible, making no sudden moves, understanding that this moment balanced on a knife's edge and any wrong gesture could tip it toward violence. "They're mine," he said. "Simple truth, no embellishment. Everything here is ours." She tilted her head slightly and two women moved forward with rope. Professional, efficient. Their hands didn't tremble as they took his rifle, his knife, his gun belt. As they bound his wrists with quick economy that spoke of practice. "You'll come with us. If you fight, you die here. If you run, you die tired. If you cooperate, you die tomorrow after we decide how." The ropes went tight around his wrists, professionally done, secure without cutting off circulation. They knew what they were doing, had done this before. His rifle disappeared into someone's pack. His knife went onto someone's belt. Steel was led away separately, the horse following docilely because horses generally did what people with authority told them to do. Ethan watched his only companion vanish around a bend in the canyon and felt something close to regret. That animal had been his friend for months, probably the closest thing to a friend he had left. "Walk," the leader said, not a request. They walked. The journey lasted hours. The sun rose higher but remained hidden by canyon walls that seemed to close in tighter with every mile. They followed passages Ethan would never find again even if he somehow escaped. The turns and branches created a maze that only someone who'd lived here for years could navigate. No one spoke. The women communicated through gestures and glances, a language built by people who'd learned that words carried too far in canyons where sound behaved unpredictably. Ethan found himself walking in the center of a formation that could have been an honor guard or a prison escort. Probably the latter. He studied them as they moved. Their ages ranged from teenagers to women who had to be past 60, all female. Not a single male face in the group. The implications of that crashed through his mind like thunder rolling between canyon walls. This wasn't coincidence. This was deliberate. Choice or consequence, or both. They emerged finally into an open area that made Ethan stop walking despite the rifle that prodded him forward. Made him stare despite knowing it was rude, despite the danger, despite everything his instincts told him about showing weakness. This wasn't a temporary camp. This was a settlement. Permanent structures built from stone and timber stood arranged in careful order. Gardens grew in organized rows, the early spring plantings just beginning to show green. Smoke rose from cook fires tended with obvious care. Animal pens held goats and chickens. Drying racks displayed meat and hides in various stages of preparation. And everywhere, women tending gardens, women carrying water, women cooking, women training with weapons, women teaching children who played under watchful eyes. Not a single man, not one. The settlement held maybe 50 people. Ethan tried to count but kept losing track as people moved between structures. 50 people, all female, living in a canyon that was supposed to be empty, that everyone believed was empty, that men entered but never left. Now he understood why the men never left. They led him to the settlement's center, where a thick wooden post stood planted deep in hard earth. The kind of post that had seen used before, worn smooth by rope and weather and time. As they tied him to it, arms pulled back at angles that would grow painful long before morning, Ethan finally understood the most important thing about his situation. These women hadn't captured him by accident. They'd been waiting. That fabric on the branch hadn't been a warning. It had been bait, and he'd followed it exactly as intended, riding alone into their territory because men like him, men with nothing left to lose, were predictable in their recklessness. The leader approached as the last knot tightened. She crouched to meet his eyes at level, close enough that Ethan could see more than just the scars, could see pain, old and deep, living behind her expression like a prisoner behind bars. "My name is Naira Blackfeather," she said quietly. "You'll stay here tonight. At dawn, we decide if you see another sunrise." She stood, paused, looked back at him with something that might have been regret or might have been calculation. "Those horses you followed, they weren't stolen. They were invited, just like you." She walked away, leaving Ethan tied under a sky turning orange with approaching sunset. Surrounded by women who moved through their camp with weapons always close and eyes that never fully looked away from him. And as darkness crept in and temperature dropped and his shoulders began their inevitable ache, Ethan realized something that should have terrified him, but instead felt almost like relief. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't alone with his ghosts. He was alone with theirs. And somehow that made all the difference. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly understand yet, was that Naira Blackfeather had lied about one thing: the horses hadn't been invited. Only Ethan had. And the reason why would change everything he thought he knew about survival, about loss, and about what it meant to truly be seen by someone who understood exactly what kind of scars never heal. Night brought cold that seeped through Ethan's shirt and into bones already aching from rope and position. The camp settled into quiet rhythms around him, a living thing breathing in patterns he was beginning to recognize. Fires banking low as darkness deepened. Voices fading to murmurs that carried on wind channeled by canyon walls. Children herded into structures with gentle firmness. Their protests met with soft words in a language Ethan didn't understand, but could read through tone and gesture. Guards remained, 3 women rotating and watching shifts that never left him unobserved. They didn't speak to him, didn't acknowledge his presence beyond checking bonds every few hours with hands that pulled tight enough to ensure security but stopped short of cruelty. There was a professionalism to their movements that spoke of training, of preparation, of a system developed through necessity rather than malice. The rope cut into his wrists. Not deeply, not yet. But he could feel the beginning of what would become serious damage if he stayed bound this way for many more hours. His shoulders screamed from the unnatural angle, muscles protesting in ways that would grow worse before they grew better, if they grew better at all. Around midnight, when the camp had gone silent except for distant sounds of animals and wind, Naira Blackfeather returned. She carried no weapon visibly, though Ethan suspected at least 2 blades hid somewhere on her body. The way she moved suggested a woman who never went unarmed, who'd learned that survival meant being prepared for violence, even in moments that seemed peaceful. Especially in moments that seemed peaceful. She settled onto the ground facing him, cross-legged, her expression unreadable in firelight that painted half her face in shadow and half in flickering orange. For a long moment, she just watched him, studying him the way a hunter might study wounded prey, trying to determine if it had fight left or had accepted its fate. "Most men beg," she said without preamble. Her voice carried no emotion, just statement of fact. "Or they threaten, or they try bargaining with things they imagine we want." Her eyes held his steadily, dark and depthless. "You've done none of those things." Ethan shifted slightly, trying to ease pressure on his shoulders without success. The movement sent fresh pain shooting down his arms. Would any of it change what happens at dawn? No. Then why waste breath on useless words? Something flickered across her face, too quick to name. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. She leaned forward slightly, studying him with renewed intensity that made him feel exposed in ways that had nothing to do with being physically restrained. You followed horses into territory everyone knows means certain death, she said. We bow. The honest answer sat heavy in Ethan's chest. He considered lying, considered silence, then decided that truth from a man facing execution cost nothing. Because I had nothing waiting back home worth protecting. Naira's expression didn't change, but her stillness became different, more attentive, like a cat that had been watching casually, suddenly focusing all its attention on movement in the grass. The horses matter that little? The horses matter, but dying here or dying alone in an empty house 6 months from now amounts to the same destination. Ethan met her eyes without flinching. At least this way is quicker. She studied him for a long moment, and Ethan saw a recognition flash across her features. The look of someone who understood exactly what he meant because she'd felt that same weight herself, had carried it until it became part of her, until the burden seemed as natural as breathing. Around them, night pressed close and intimate, creating a bubble where truth felt safer than it should. The kind of dangerous honesty that came when two people who'd lost everything met in darkness and found they had nothing left to hide because nothing remained worth protecting. What emptied your house? Her voice had softened fractionally, barely noticeable except that Ethan had spent 3 years listening for any human warmth in voices that mostly offered pity or avoidance. Fire. The word came easier than expected, maybe because darkness made confession simpler. 3 years back, my wife Margaret, my daughter Lily, they were inside when the kitchen hearth sparked wrong. I was in the far pasture checking fence lines. He breathed slowly, evenly, keeping his voice level through practice. Through 3 years of learning to talk about it without breaking. Because breaking meant people looked at you differently, and he'd grown tired of those looks. By the time I saw smoke and rode back, the whole structure was burning. I tried going in. The heat pushed me back. I tried again and again, until neighbors arrived and held me down while I watched it collapse. Naira's face had gone very still. Behind her, Ethan noticed other women had moved closer, drawn by voices in the quiet. They listened without pretense, without hiding their attention. Just stood in the darkness beyond the firelight and bore witness to grief being spoken aloud. I pulled bodies from ash the next morning, Ethan continued, unable to stop now that he'd started. The words had been dammed up for 3 years, and once the flood began, it swept everything before it. Buried them in the corner of the property where Margaret used to grow flowers. Built markers with my hands. Then I lived in that house alone for 6 months before I couldn't anymore. The specific details came automatically. Facts he'd recited to himself so many times they'd become ritual. Margaret was 32. Lily had just turned 7. Under Montana territorial law, I was sole heir to our homestead. 160 acres claimed under the Homestead Act of 1862. After 6 months, I sold 120 acres at $5 per acre. Kept 40 acres in the horses because they didn't remind me of what I'd lost. Silence stretched after his words, thick and heavy. One of the younger women, barely more than a girl, had tears tracking down her face. Even the guards had shifted closer, weapons lowered slightly, drawn by the gravity of shared grief. Naira's voice, when she finally spoke, carried weight that hadn't been there before. You understand what it means to lose everything to violence you couldn't stop. I understand, Ethan held her gaze. I also understand that loss doesn't give anyone the right to inflict it on others. Those horses were taken, invited or not. I came to retrieve what was mine. If that earns execution, then execute. But don't pretend this is justice. It's just more loss creating more loss. The words hung between them like a challenge, like an accusation, like truth that cut because it was true. Naira stood slowly, her expression unreadable again, walls rebuilt. But something had shifted. Ethan felt it in how the women watching didn't look away immediately, in how their postures had changed from hostile to something more complex. Understanding maybe, or at least the beginning of it. At dawn, Naira said, turning away, we decide. But as she walked back toward the main fire, Ethan noticed she didn't order the guards to tighten his bonds, didn't reinforce threats, didn't add new warnings, just left him there with women who now watched him differently. their expressions complicated by something he hadn't expected them to offer: understanding, and maybe, despite everything, the first thread of unwilling respect, which made what happened next feel less like coincidence and more like a test he hadn't known he was taking. The howls started an hour before dawn, distant at first, then closer with the deliberate approach of predators who knew their prey couldn't escape. Ethan's head jerked up from the half-sleep exhaustion had granted him. Every instinct suddenly sharp and focused despite the pain, despite the exhaustion, despite everything. He'd heard those sounds before, knew exactly what they meant. Wolves, a pack. And they were hunting. The camp exploded into motion. Women grabbed weapons and formed defensive positions with practiced speed that spoke of preparation, of drills run until they became instinct. Shouting orders in their language while herding children toward the central structures. Building fires higher, creating walls of light that should deter the animals, should being the critical word that everyone present understood. Ethan yanked against his bonds hard enough to feel rope-burned skin. The post creaked, but held. He scanned the perimeter with a rancher's expertise, reading the terrain and the animal behavior and the weakness in their defenses that would get someone killed if it wasn't addressed immediately. "They're circling from the east side," he shouted, his voice rough from disuse but carrying clearly in the pre-dawn darkness. "Your fire line has a gap near the supply tent." Naira spun toward him, bow already drawn, suspicion warring with urgency on her face. "How do you know?" "Because that's where your scent trails are weakest and the shadows run deepest. That's where I'd attack if I were them." Ethan pulled harder against the post, feeling wood creak slightly. "You need to close that gap now or they'll punch through and get to the children." For a heartbeat, Naira hesitated, trust warring with caution. The reasonable fear that this might be manipulation, that the prisoner might be using chaos to escape or worse. Then she barked orders and 3 warriors sprinted toward the eastern perimeter, taking positions exactly where Ethan had indicated. Just in time. Gray shapes materialized from darkness like smoke gaining substance, eyes reflecting firelight with that distinctive wolf shine, predatory intelligence assessing defenses and looking for weakness. At least 8 animals, maybe more, testing the perimeter with the coordinated strategy of pack hunters who'd learned that humans protected the weak predictably. These weren't desperate animals. These were experienced predators who discovered that human settlements offered opportunity if you were smart enough to exploit the patterns. They'd done this before, probably succeeded before. And they'd come back because success bred confidence, bred more attempts. The youngest warrior, a girl Ethan had noticed crying earlier during his confession, held position near the supply area with a spear that trembled in her grip. She couldn't have been more than 16, 17 at most, fear written clearly across her face despite the brave stance she maintained, despite the weapon she held with white-knuckled determination. When the largest wolf feinted left, then charged right, she stumbled backward. The spear dropped as she fell, defensive position collapsing exactly as the predator had calculated it would. Ethan didn't think, didn't calculate, just threw his full weight against the prey with everything he had, feeling old wood crack and shift. The rope holding his wrist dug in until warm blood ran down his forearms, slick and hot against cold skin. But he kept pulling, kept forcing, muscles screaming as he tried to break bonds that had been tied by people who knew their craft. "Kaya, roll left!" He roared the warning as the wolf closed distance, massive jaws opening for a killing strike. And somehow the girl heard him through her panic. Heard and obeyed with the instant response of someone too frightened to question, just reacted on pure instinct. She tumbled sideways just as those jaws snapped closed where her throat had been a second before. An arrow took the wolf mid-leap. A woman Ethan would later learn was named Amma Proudwing, her shot clean and lethal, the kind of archery that came from years of practice and natural talent combined. The animal dropped, dead before it hit the ground. But 2 more animals had already broken through the mum, heading straight for the structures where children huddled. Their cries carried thin and terrified on the cold air, the sound that made every adult present forget their own safety and think only of protecting the vulnerable. Ethan pulled harder against the post, feeling it crack further, feeling rope slice deeper into flesh he could no longer feel from his hands being numb with restricted circulation. He didn't care about pain, didn't care about damage, just cared that the girl was scrambling backward on the ground and another wolf had circled behind her position and someone was about to die if he couldn't break free. Cut him loose! Naira's voice cut through chaos like a blade through silk, sharp and absolute, carrying authority that expected instant obedience. Do it now. But he'll run! One of the guards protested, even as she moved toward him with her knife drawn, even as she prepared to obey despite her objections. He would have already shouted for them to attack our weak points if he wanted us destroyed. Naira drew her bowstring back, eyes never leaving the advancing wolves. Her voice carried absolute certainty. Cut him loose, now! The knife sliced through rope and Ethan's arms dropped forward, shoulders exploding with pain from hours of unnatural position. He had maybe 3 seconds before circulation returned enough for control. He used them to grab the fallen spear near his feet and lunged toward Kaya, planting himself between her and the circling wolf with a weapon he could barely grip properly. The animal charged. Ethan set the spear butt against ground and angled the point up, every movement familiar from years of defending livestock against predators that saw ranches as feeding grounds. The kind of muscle memory that lived deeper than conscious thought, that came from repetition until it became instinct. The wolf impaled itself trying to reach him, weight and momentum driving the point deep through chest and into vital organs. It died with a yelp that sent the rest of the pack scattering backward, reassessing prey that had suddenly become dangerous instead of vulnerable. Ethan stayed standing between Kaya and darkness, spear ready despite hands slick with his own blood, despite arms that shook from exhaustion and pain. He stayed there until the wolves finally retreated into pre-dawn shadows, until Naira called cease and warriors lowered weapons with the careful relief of people who'd survived but knew how close it had been. Only then did Ethan allow himself to drop to one knee, breathing hard, watching blood drip from his wrists onto earth that had already seen too much of it. Around him, women stared with expressions he couldn't quite read. Not gratitude exactly. Something more complicated. Respect, maybe. Recognition, certainly. The look people give someone who's revealed themselves to be different than expected. Kaya stood slowly, retrieved her spear with trembling hands, then did something that made the entire camp go silent. She placed her hand on Ethan's shoulder, squeezed once with firm acknowledgement, and spoke words he didn't need translated to understand. Thank you, you didn't have to, but you did. Naira approached as dawn finally broke over the canyon walls, painting everything in shades of gold and red that seemed too beautiful for a place that had just witnessed violence. She extended her hand to help Ethan stand, the first time she'd offered him anything resembling the assistance. You could have run, she said quietly. You were free. You had weapons. You could have disappeared into darkness while we fought. Ethan met her eyes steadily, too exhausted for anything but truth. Where exactly would I run to that matters more than here? Something shifted in Naira's expression, a wall cracking that might never fully repair itself. She held his gaze for a long moment, then turned to face her warriors, her voice carrying authority that expected obedience without question. He stays untied. We'll discuss what that means after we tend wounds and secure the perimeter. She looked back at Ethan with an expression that held weariness, but also acknowledgement. You've earned this much at least. Don't make me regret it. But as she walked away to organize the camp's recovery, Ethan noticed how every woman he passed looked at him differently now. Not as a prisoner awaiting execution, as something else entirely. Something they hadn't expected to find bound to a post in their camp. A man who'd chosen protecting them over saving himself, and in doing so had begun rewriting every assumption they'd built about men like him. The healer approached as women began cleaning up from the attack. Her name was Icy, Ethan would learn later, 45 years old with the kind of quiet observation that came from seeing people at their most vulnerable. She worked near the morning fire, cleaning Ethan's wrists with hands that moved with practiced efficiency. The wounds were deep, rope burns that had cut through skin to muscle, made worse by his desperate struggle to break free. They would scar, leave permanent marks that he'd carry the rest of his life as reminder of this night. Icy applied a salve that stung briefly before numbing the pain. The mixture smelled of yarrow and comfrey, herbs Ethan recognized from his own frontier medicine. good for bleeding and healing both. She wrapped clean fabric around both wrists with the kind of professional care that had suggested training, experience, someone who'd tended many wounds over many years. You could have let Kaya face her consequence, Easy said softly as she worked. Most men would have used chaos as opportunity for escape. Most men haven't spent 3 years understanding that running from one place just means arriving somewhere else equally empty, Ethan replied. I studied him with the intensity of someone trained to see beyond surfaces, to read injury that lived deeper than skin. She nodded once, almost to herself, then gathered her supplies and left without another word. But Ethan noticed how she paused near Naira, spoke quietly, gestured toward him with movements that suggested recommendation rather than warning. Throughout the morning, Ethan remained where Naira had indicated he could stay, a spot near the eastern edge that offered view of the entire camp, but remained separate from main activity. Women passed regularly, some glancing his direction with expressions ranging from suspicion to something approaching gratitude. Children peered at him from behind their mothers, fascinated by this strange man who'd appeared in their exclusively female world. When the sun reached its highest point, Amma Proudwing approached with purpose in her stride. The archer who'd killed the first wolf, moving with the confidence of someone comfortable with violence. Someone who'd learned to trust her own skills because her life and others' lives depended on those skills being reliable. She carried rope in a heavy bundle of cut wood, dropping both at Ethan's feet without ceremony. The corral fence needs repair from where the wolves tested it. You know how to work with your hands? Ethan looked at the materials, then at her face, reading the test clearly. I do. Then prove your keep or prove Naira wrong for letting you live. Amma turned away, then paused. No one watches you now. Eastern Trail leads out of the canyon. We both know you could follow it. I could. Ethan stood slowly, gathering wood and rope. Won't, though. Why not? The answer came easier than it should have. Because for the first time in 3 years, I'm somewhere that people needed me to stay alive. That matters more than freedom. Something shifted in Amma's expression, a crack in her hardness that let through brief warmth before the walls came back up. She nodded curtly and walked away. But Ethan noticed she didn't assign anyone to guard him. The message was clear. He could leave. They wouldn't stop him. But staying meant something different than captivity now. He spent hours repairing the corral fence, using skills learned from years of ranch work. The wood was juniper, 4-inch diameter posts that would resist rot for decades if set properly. He used mortise and tenon joints for strength, the kind of carpentry that took time but lasted. Twisted manila rope, 3/4 inch thick, tied with bowline knots and clove hitches and lashing techniques that would hold against pressure from panicked horses or aggressive predators. Other women worked nearby, tending gardens and preparing food, occasionally glancing his direction to assess progress. Their presence felt less like surveillance and more like gradual acceptance of someone existing in their space. Not welcomed yet, not trusted fully, but tolerated, acknowledged, seen as potentially belonging rather than definitively threatening. By late afternoon, he'd finished the first repair and begun working on a second section that showed wear. The physical labor felt good after 3 years of just going through motions. His shoulders ached from the morning's binding, but the pain was clean, honest, the kind that came from work rather than grief. Kaya approached as the evening shadows grew long. She moved with the uncertainty of youth trying to appear brave, stopping a careful distance away with her hands clasped in front of her body. My mother says I should thank you properly, she said. Her voice carried the slight tremor of someone forcing courage. For saving my life. Ethan set down his tools and faced her fully. You don't owe me thanks for doing what any decent person would do. But you weren't any person. You were a prisoner who'd been told he would die at dawn. Kaya stepped closer, and Ethan saw her mother watching from across camp with protective alertness. You could have let me face the wolf, could have used the distraction to escape. Instead, you nearly broke your own wrists trying to reach me. Your life mattered more than my freedom. The words came simply, carrying truth that needed no embellishment. Kaya's eyes filled with tears. She blinked away quickly. She stepped forward suddenly and placed something in Ethan's palm. A small carved figure, rough but recognizable as a horse, made from wood worn smooth by handling. My father made this before he... She didn't finish, didn't need to. The pause said everything. I want you to have it, as a reminder that some men can still be worth knowing. She left before Ethan could respond, running back toward her mother who wrapped an arm around her shoulders while watching Ethan with an expression that held less hostility than it had that morning. He looked down at the carved horse in his palm, feeling weight that had nothing to do with wood and everything to do with meaning. A girl who'd lost her father, trusting him with a memory of that loss. The kind of gift that carried responsibility heavier than gold. When Naira found him as evening approached, he was still holding it. The council has deliberated, she said without preamble. You've earned the right to stay as long as you prove useful and respectful. She paused, measuring him. But tonight you face one final test, one that will determine whether you truly understand what it means to exist among us without bringing the violence most men carry in their bones. Ethan closed his fingers around the carved horse. What test? Naira's expression remained unreadable. You'll see after dark. Be ready. She walked away, leaving Ethan with sunset painting the canyon walls in shades of amber and red, holding a child's carved horse, and wondering what final test awaited that would decide if he'd truly found something worth staying for. They came for him after the moon rose. A dozen women moving through shadows with purpose that made Ethan's pulse quicken despite his determination to remain calm. Naira led them, her expression unreadable in firelight that painted faces in shades of copper and darkness. They formed a circle around him where he stood near the corral, close enough that he could smell sage smoke on their clothing and feel the heat of their bodies displacing cool night air. No one spoke. No one explained. They simply watched him with eyes that held questions he couldn't yet understand. Naira stepped forward and the others tightened their circle until Ethan stood surrounded by women whose proximity felt deliberate, testing, weighted with meaning beyond simple observation. His instinct screamed to step back, to demand space, to assert the boundary most men would defend without thinking. Instead, he forced himself to remain still, to breathe evenly, and to let them control the moment without resistance. You've proven you can protect, Naira said quietly. Now prove you can submit. The word hung in the air like smoke, complex and dangerous. Ethan met her eyes, reading the challenge clearly. This wasn't about physical submission. This was about whether he could exist among them without needing to dominate, without requiring control, without letting his presence become threat through proximity and strength. Amma moved first, stepping close enough that Ethan could feel warmth radiating from her skin. She placed one hand on his shoulder, firm but not aggressive, measuring muscle and tension beneath her palm. Her eyes never left his face, watching for reaction, for the flash of anger or desire that would prove him like other men they'd known. Ethan held perfectly still, letting her touch exist without responding to it, without interpreting it as invitation or insult, just accepting that she needed to test him this way, needed to know if closeness triggered violence or demand. Icy approached next, placing her hand over his heart, feeling the rapid beat beneath his ribs that he couldn't control even if he controlled everything else. Her expression softened slightly as she felt his pulse, recognizing fear being mastered rather than absence of it. He's terrified, she murmured to Naira, but not of us, of failing whatever this is. Others moved closer then, hands touching his arms, his back, his face with curiosity that held no seduction, but rather assessment. They were learning him through touch the way they might learn a horse, checking for hidden wounds, for places where pressure created resistance or rage, testing if he would grab, would push, would use superior strength to reclaim control of his own body. Ethan closed his eyes, not in avoidance but in acceptance, letting himself be vulnerable in a way he hadn't allowed since Margaret died, letting women he barely knew touch him with hands that mapped scars and tension, while he stood undefended and chose trust over self-preservation. Kaya knelt before him, looking up with tears streaming down her face. No man has ever stood like this among us, she whispered. They all fought, all of them. I'm not fighting. Ethan's voice was rough with emotion he couldn't entirely suppress. I'm surrendering to being seen. The words created stillness so complete that even breathing seemed loud. Naira moved closer until she stood directly in front of him, her face inches from his own. She placed both hands on either side of his face, tilting it down so he met her eyes at close range. We. The single word carried weight of every loss she'd suffered, every betrayal she'd witnessed, every reason she'd built this refuge of women away from men who'd proven themselves monsters through violence and violation. Because being alone forever is worse than risking being hurt again. Ethan held her gaze despite tears burning behind his eyes. Because you've all lost something, and I've lost everything. And maybe broken people can exist together without breaking each other further. Naira's hands trembled against his face, the first crack in her armor that Ethan had witnessed. Around them, women who'd watched with suspicion now looked at him with something approaching wonder. Not because he'd proven strong, because he'd proven capable of weakness without shame. What was her name? Naira asked softly. Your wife. Margaret, and my daughter was Lily. They died because I wasn't there to save them. My husband was called Dakota. Naira's voice fractured on the name. My sons were Chayton and Kahana. They died because I was there, but couldn't stop the violence. Behind her, other women murmured names of their own dead with voices that carried 3 years of grief, finally given permission to speak itself aloud. They began to kneel one by one until Ethan stood at the center of a circle of kneeling women who looked up at him not with worship but with recognition. He was their grief reflected back in male form. He was proof that loss didn't belong exclusively to their gender. When Naira finally released his face and stepped back, her expression had transformed completely. You've passed the test, but you've done something more dangerous than that. Ethan's breath caught. What? You've made us remember that before we were warriors, we were human. And humans who've lost everything either harden into stone or learn to hold tenderness carefully in scarred hands. She glanced around at her women, seeing them differently than before. You've shown us which choice you've made. Now we have to decide if we're brave enough to make it too. But even as relief flooded through Ethan, even as women began to stand and disperse with expressions softer than when they'd arrived, he couldn't shake the feeling that passing this test meant he'd committed to something far more complicated than simple survival. But even as relief flooded through Ethan, even as women began to stand and disperse with expressions softer than when they'd arrived, he couldn't shake the feeling that passing this test meant he'd committed to something far more complicated than simple survival. The real work of earning their trust, of building a life here, of learning to be whole again, that was only beginning. The night of the submission test marked a turning point. When Ethan woke the next morning, stiff from sleeping on hard ground, but free from bonds for the first time since his capture, he found the camp had shifted around him. Women nodded as he passed. Children no longer hid behind their mothers. Even the guards who'd watched him with such suspicion now offered brief smiles of acknowledgement. He was no longer a prisoner. But what was he exactly? The answer would reveal itself in the weeks that followed. Days became a rhythm Ethan hadn't known he'd been craving. He woke with the camp at dawn, when the first light painted the canyon walls in shades of rose and gold, worked alongside women who gradually stopped watching his every movement with suspicion, shared meals around fires where conversation flowed in mixtures of their language and his until understanding happened through gesture as much as words. He taught them techniques for preserving meat through the coming season, methods his father had learned from German immigrants who'd settled in Pennsylvania before pushing west, how to reinforce structures against weather using cross-bracing that distributed weight and wind load, methods for training horses that relied on patience rather than force, on understanding that fear created resistance while trust created partnership. They taught him their ways of reading land, of moving through territory without leaving traces that would draw unwanted attention, of understanding wind and sky with attention he'd forgotten men could possess, how to find water in places that looked bone dry, which plants could heal and which could kill, and how sometimes the difference was just a matter of dosage and timing. 3 weeks after the night of testing, Naira found him near the horse corral where he'd been working with a young mare. The animal was skittish from past trauma, some violence Ethan could only guess at. He'd spent hours simply existing in her space, letting her approach on her terms, showing that proximity didn't automatically mean pain. The mare had finally allowed him to touch her neck that morning, trembling but trusting. The small victory felt more significant than anything he'd accomplished in years. more meaningful than all the fence posts he'd ever set or all the land he'd ever claimed. Because this was about healing rather than building, about patience rather than force. "You have a gift with broken things," Naira observed, leaning against the fence with arms crossed, "making them believe healing is possible." Ethan's hand went unconsciously to his shirt pocket where he'd taken to carrying the small carved horse Kaya had given him. The wood was warm against his chest, worn smooth from being touched so often. A talisman, a reminder, a promise that some things broken could be trusted again. Ethan stroked the mare's neck with careful gentleness, feeling muscle relax slightly under his palm. "I understand what it feels like to be convinced you're too damaged for anything good again. Is that why you stayed, to heal?" She moved closer, and the mare didn't shy away despite another person's presence, a testament to how calm Ethan kept his energy, how safe he made the space feel. "Maybe." Ethan considered the question seriously. "Or maybe I stayed because leaving would mean going back to being alone with ghosts that don't speak." He met Naira's eyes. Here at least the ghosts are shared. She was quiet for a long moment, watching him work with the horse. Her expression carried weight of someone deciding whether to trust words that lived too painful to speak aloud. Finally, she drew breath and began, voice steady through visible effort. "4 years ago, this canyon held both men and women. We lived as families, raised children together, existed in balance that felt permanent." She paused, gathering strength for what came next. "Then settlers came claiming land they said belonged to them through papers we couldn't read and laws we never agreed to follow." Ethan's hand stilled on the mare's neck. He didn't turn, didn't interrupt, just listened with the complete attention she deserved. "They showed us the Treaty of Fort Laramie, signed in 1868, said we had to move to reservation land in the north. But this canyon belonged to our grandfather's grandfathers. 5 generations of our people had lived in this place." Her voice hardened. "We refused. Said their treaty meant nothing to people who never signed it." The mare shifted nervously, picking up on tension in the air. Ethan resumed the gentle stroking, keeping his movements calm even as his gut tightened with dread for where the story was heading. "When we refused to leave, they returned with more men, more weapons. 40 armed men, some wearing United States cavalry uniforms. They had Springfield rifles, military issue, and they had Marshal William Kane with Sheen, the man who called us hostiles for refusing to abandon our home." Ethan closed his eyes against the image forming in his mind. He'd heard stories like this before. Every man on the frontier had heard them. Most chose not to think too hard about what those stories meant, about the violence required to build what they called civilization. "They attacked at dawn, burned our structures. My husband Dakota tried to defend our sons." Naira's voice fractured slightly, the first time Ethan had heard her lose control. "He died with arrows in his back while Chayton and Kohana ran toward me screaming. They were 7 and 9 years old." She paused, breathing carefully, rebuilding composure through sheer will. "I reached them. I was holding them both when the bullets came. I felt their bodies jerk in my arms, felt their blood soak into my dress, watched light leave their eyes while I knelt in dirt that turned to mud from what spilled out of them." The words painted images Ethan wished he couldn't see, but he forced himself not to look away from them, not to diminish her pain by refusing to witness it fully. This was her story, her loss. The least he could do was bear witness without flinching. 70 people lived here before that morning. 19 women survived. No men, no boys over 12. Naira's hands gripped the fence hard enough that her knuckles whitened. "We buried everyone in the canyon's far end. Then we made a choice. No more men, no more trusting that violence wouldn't follow them into our home. We would survive alone, raise daughters alone, exist without ever again believing that safety could include male presence." She turned to face him fully. "Until you arrived and proved you could stand among us without bringing the violence we'd learned to expect. You're the first man we've allowed to live here in 4 years. The first one who didn't immediately try to take, to control, to assert dominance through force or threat." That evening, the women gathered around the central fire and sang mourning songs that carried names of the dead into darkness. Ethan sat at the circle's edge, listening to loss given voice through melody that needed no translation. When they sang for children taken too soon, His throat tightened with emotion he'd kept locked behind walls built from survival and shame. Isai noticed. She moved to sit beside him, placing her hand over his with quiet understanding. You're allowed to grieve here. We all do. The permission broke something inside Ethan that he'd held rigid for 3 years. Tears came silently at first, then with shaking he couldn't control. Grief finally finding release among people who understood exactly what it meant to lose everything and still somehow continue breathing. Naira's voice rose above others, singing a name that must have been her husband's, and Ethan added his voice to hers, speaking Margaret and Lily's names into night air for the first time since their burial. Around him, women joined the speaking of names, creating a chorus of loss acknowledged and witnessed. When the songs ended and silence settled heavy with catharsis, Amma Proudwing approached with Kaya behind her. The older warrior placed her hand on Ethan's shoulder with firmness that carried meaning beyond the simple gesture. You are no longer outsiders here, Amma said, her voice carrying authority of someone whose word held weight in this community. You are brother to us now, family earned through choice rather than blood. Warmth flooded through Ethan, acceptance he'd stopped believing he deserved. But even as relief settled into his bones, hoofbeats echoed from the canyon entrance, distant but approaching, multiple horses moving with purpose. And everything they'd carefully built was about to face its first real test. The camp transformed instantly. Women grabbed weapons and herded children toward protected areas with practiced efficiency that spoke of preparation for this exact scenario. Naira issued orders in their language, sharp and clear, while warriors took defensive positions along the canyon's natural choke points. Within moments, the settlement looked empty, except for guards hidden in shadows with arrows nocked and ready. The kind of preparation that came from expecting attack, from knowing that safety was always temporary and vigilance was the price of survival. Ethan moved toward the perimeter without thinking, instinct driving him toward threat rather than away from it. Amma caught his arm, her grip iron strong. You stay hidden. If they see you here, they'll know we harbor outsiders. They'll use it as an excuse for violence. How many times have they come before? Ethan kept his voice low, watching the canyon entrance where dust rose from approaching horses. Twice, both times demanding we leave, claiming this land belongs to settlers now. Naira appeared beside them, bow in hand, expression carved from stone. Both times we've held them off through superior position and their reluctance to die for someone else's claim. But each time they returned with more men and less patience. The riders emerged into view, 7 men armed with rifles and revolvers, led by someone wearing a marshal's badge that caught sunlight with authority meant to intimidate. They stopped 50 feet from the nearest structure, scanning the apparently empty camp with expressions ranging from suspicion to outright hostility. We know you're here, the marshal called out. His voice carried the confidence of a man used to being obeyed, backed by the weight of law and the threat of violence. We're looking for a man, Ethan Cross. White, tall, likely on foot or horseback. His animals were found abandoned near your territory 3 weeks back. You know anything about that? Silence answered him, the kind of silence that felt deliberate, weighted with unspoken challenge. The marshal shifted in his saddle, hand resting casually on his weapon. The gesture was meant to look relaxed but carried clear threat. We can do this easy or hard. Easy as you tell us what you know, and we ride out peaceful. Hard as we search every structure until we find answers. Your choice. Ethan felt every muscle in his body tense with decision warring against itself. He could step out, end this confrontation before it escalated, protect these women from violence he'd inadvertently brought to their refuge. Or he could stay hidden, trust them to handle threat they'd faced before, except that sometimes protection meant allowing others to defend what they'd built. Before he could choose, Naira stepped into view with 3 other warriors flanking her. They moved with confidence that came from knowing terrain and having nothing left to lose. This is our land, Naira stated flatly. Recognized by treaty, your people signed and broke. No man has entered our canyon in 4 years. If his animals were found nearby, perhaps he met the same end that awaits anyone who trespasses where they're not welcome. The marshal's eyes narrowed. That sounds like a threat. That sounds like information. Naira didn't blink, didn't shift her stance. You've gotten your answer. Now leave before you discover how seriously we take our boundaries. Tension stretched tight as bowstring. The kind of moment where single wrong word or movement could ignite violence. Nobody present would survive unchanged. Ethan saw the marshal calculating odds, weighing pride against potential casualties. Recognizing that women defending home territory with superior position weren't prey to be easily taken. Then Ethan made his choice. He stepped from hiding, hands visible and empty, walking toward the confrontation with steady purpose that made both sides react with surprise. Ama hissed his name in warning, but he kept moving until he stood beside Nairo, positioning himself deliberately between the marshal and the woman who had offered him sanctuary. "I'm Ethan Cross," he said clearly. "I came here tracking horses. Got caught in a storm, took shelter, waited it out." The lie came smooth as truth, protecting their secret with a story that covered reality. These women showed hospitality when they could have shown hostility. "I'm leaving now on my own terms, causing no trouble." He started walking toward the riders, each step taking him away from the only place he'd felt human in 3 years. But before he'd made it halfway, Naira's voice stopped him cold. "No." The single word carried such absolute authority that even the marshal's horse shifted nervously. Naira moved to stand beside Ethan, then Amma joined them, then Isi, then Kaya, until every warrior in the camp formed a line between him and the men who'd come searching. "He stays," Naira stated, "under our protection, by our choice. If you have issue with that, you are welcome to try removing him." Her smile held no warmth, only promise of cost. "But I guarantee you won't all ride away to Trowan." The marshal studied the line of women, studied Ethan's face for signs of coercion, and found none, studied the defensive positions he could now see hidden in rocks and shadows. His calculations shifted visibly. Whatever he'd expected to find, it wasn't a man protected by warriors willing to die for his right to stay. "You're choosing them over your own people?" The marshal directed his question at Ethan with disgust clear in his tone. Ethan met his eyes steadily. "I'm choosing family over strangers who show up making demands on land they have no right to claim." The words hung in air thick with implication. The marshal's jaw tightened, but he was smart enough to recognize when odds had shifted against him. He wheeled his horse around with movement sharp as anger. "This isn't finished," he called back. "We'll return with more men." They rode away, dust rising behind them, threat trailing in their wake. When hoofbeats finally faded, Amma turned to Ethan with expression mixing fury and something approaching pride. "You fool, you could have left safely." "I could have," Ethan agreed, "but then I wouldn't be family anymore. And family doesn't abandon each other when trouble comes." In that moment, with women surrounding him who'd risked themselves to defend his right to stay, Ethan understood he hadn't just found refuge. He'd found home. 3 months passed without the marshal's return, though everyone knew the threat lingered like storm clouds on distant horizons. Ethan stopped wondering when they'd come back and started focusing on what he could build in whatever time remained. He worked alongside the women with hands that had forgotten what purpose felt like until now, repairing structures and teaching skills while learning their ways of reading land and sky with attention that made survival feel less like burden and more like art. But it was the small moments that revealed how completely he'd been woven into the fabric of their community. Kaya sought him out each evening to practice the horse training techniques he'd taught her confidence growing with each animal that learned to trust her gentle approach. She looked at him the way she might have looked at a father, with admiration uncomplicated by fear or disappointment. The trust in her eyes carried weight heavier than gold. Icy brought him tea made from herbs she gathered, always appearing when his shoulders tensed from old injuries or his expression went distant with memories. She saw him as healer recognizes healer, someone who understood that some wounds required time and patience more than any medicine could provide. Her quiet presence had become comfort he relied on without realizing how much he needed it. Amma trained with him in combat techniques, testing his skills while teaching him their methods of fighting that prioritized efficiency over brute strength. She'd stopped viewing him as potential threat and started seeing him as warrior worthy of respect, calling him brother with pride that made the word mean everything. When they sparred, she held nothing back, and the trust implicit in that openness meant more than gentleness ever could. The other women had each found their own relationship with him. Some valued his strength for heavy labor. Others appreciated his patience with children who'd never known male presence without violence attached. Some simply enjoyed his quiet company during evening fires, the way he listened more than he spoke, the way his presence had become familiar rather than foreign. But it was Naira whose regard mattered most, and whose regard had shifted in ways neither of them fully acknowledged aloud. She sought him out at dawn and dusk, times when the camp lay quiet and conversation could happen without audience. They spoke of loss and survival, of the weight of leading people who'd suffered more than anyone should bear, of the exhaustion that came from remaining strong when all you wanted was permission to crumble. One evening, as sunset painted the canyon walls in shades of copper and gold, Naira found him working on the corral fence where the mare he'd gentled now stood calm and trusting. She watched him for a long moment before speaking, her expression holding something he couldn't quite name. "You could leave now," she said quietly. "The trail east would take you back to settled territory. You could reclaim whatever life you left behind." Ethan set down his tools and turned to face her fully. What life? Empty house, silent days, existing without purpose or connection. He shook his head slowly. "I'd rather face whatever threat that marshal brings than return to that. Even knowing we can't promise safety, that violence might find us again, especially knowing that." Ethan stepped closer, close enough to see firelight reflected in her eyes. Because facing danger alongside people who matter is better than safety that feels like slow burial. Naira held his gaze with intensity that made breathing difficult. "You've changed us. We were surviving. Now we're living again. You reminded us that not all men carry violence in their bones, that some carry grief that's made them gentle instead of hard. You changed me too." Ethan's voice roughened with emotion. "I came here ready to die. You gave me reason to live." She reached out and took his hand, lacing their fingers together with deliberateness that spoke of decision made carefully. Around them, women who'd been watching from discreet distances smiled with understanding that needed no words. They'd all seen this building between their leader and the man who'd proven himself worthy through vulnerability rather than force. "Then stay," Naira said simply. "Not as guest or temporary presence. Stay as one of us, as family, as whatever we become to each other in time." Ethan looked around the camp that had transformed from prison to refuge to home. He saw Kaya waving from near the horses, Isi tending herbs with peaceful focus, Amma sharpening weapons while humming songs he now recognized. He saw women who'd been broken by violence learning to trust again. Children growing up knowing that male presence didn't automatically mean danger. A community rebuilding itself with stronger foundations than before. He'd won more than their hearts. He'd won his own back from the ashes of a fire that had taken everything. "I'll stay," he said, and felt the words settle into his bones like truth he'd been searching for without knowing the shape of what he sought. "For as long as you'll have me." Naira smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, and suddenly Ethan understood what Margaret would have wanted for him. Not eternal mourning, not isolated existence, but this, new purpose, new family, new chance at life built on foundation of loss transformed into wisdom. That night around the fire, with women who'd become his family, Ethan laughed at a story Kaya told with animated gestures. The sound felt foreign in his throat, rusty from disuse, but genuine in a way nothing had been for 3 years. And when Naira's hand found his in the darkness, fingers intertwining with easy familiarity, Ethan finally understood what it meant to be home. But peace was a fragile thing on the frontier, and the marshal's promise of return was an empty threat. They came at dawn 3 months and 2 weeks after the first encounter. Amma on watch duty spotted dust rising in the distance, multiple riders moving with military precision. This wasn't a negotiation force. This was an invasion. The warning bell rang and the camp exploded into organized chaos. Children rushed into the cave system they'd prepared for exactly this scenario. Elders armed themselves and positioned at innermost defense. Warriors took positions along canyon walls, Ethan with them, rifle in hand, no longer questioning his place among them. The marshal's army stopped at the canyon entrance just out of arrow range. 22 men, better armed than before, more determined. Marshal William Kane sat his horse at the front, flanked by hired guns and deputized settlers and men who saw opportunity in violence. His voice echoed off canyon walls. Last chance. Send out the man, leave this territory, and no one dies today. Refuse and we come in by force. You have 10 minutes to decide. Naira stood on a high rock, visible to all, her voice carrying clearly through morning air. This is our land, our home, our family. You want it? Come and take it. But know that every step into this canyon will be paid for in blood, and we have nothing left to lose. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Marshal Kane raised his hand and dropped it. The charge began. The battle unfolded with terrible inevitability. Arrows from heights took 3 men in the first volley. Others took cover behind rocks, returning fire that chipped stone and ricocheted dangerously. Children's screams echoed from caves despite distance, the sound that made every defender forget their own safety. Ethan held position on the eastern wall with Amma and 4 other warriors. His rifle fire was steady and accurate, covering their reload times, muscle memory from a war 20 years past, returning when needed. He'd fought for the Union in '63, learned that killing from distance was easier than looking a man in the eyes while taking his life. Marshal Kane split his force into 3 groups, flanking maneuvers on both canyon walls, central push with main force. It was working. They were too many, too organized, too determined. Amma took a bullet to the shoulder, the impact spinning her around, blood spraying hot across stone. Ethan caught her, lowered her to cover, his hands already moving to staunch bleeding. "Don't you dare let them through," she gritted through pain. "Not a chance." He stood, exposing himself to draw fire away from the wounded warrior, dropping 2 men advancing on their position. A third bullet grazed his ribs, burning line of fire that made him stumble but didn't stop him. He kept firing until his rifle clicked empty. Naira's position came under heavy assault. 5 men reached her rock outcropping, overwhelming her defenses. She was out of arrows, drawing blade, fighting with grace born of desperation. But they were too many. Ethan saw it happening, didn't think, just moved. Dropped his rifle, grabbed a fallen warrior's spear, ran across open ground with bullets kicking up dirt around his feet. The prayer that formed in his mind was simple. "Margaret, if you're watching, guide my aim." He threw the spear with everything he had. It took the lead attacker through the chest, the man falling backward off the rock. The momentary confusion gave Naira the opening she needed. She dropped 2 more with blade work that was brutal, efficient, beautiful. But Ethan was exposed in open ground. Marshal Kane had clear shot. He raised his rifle, aimed at Ethan's chest. Time slowed in the way it does when death approaches, every detail crystalline and sharp. The arrow appeared from nowhere. Kaya's shot, perfect despite her youth, despite her fear, despite everything. It took the marshal through the shoulder, his shot going wide. The bullet meant for Ethan's heart, instead striking stone 3 feet to his left. The turning point came in that moment. Marshal wounded, men seeing their leader fall, the realization settling over them that these women would fight to the last breath, that taking this canyon would cost more than any of them were willing to pay. The retreat began raggedly, men dragging wounded back, leaving 7 dead behind. The marshal clutched his shoulder, blood seeping between fingers, his face twisted with pain and fury and the bitter knowledge of defeat. As they disappeared from view, dust settling in their wake, women emerged from positions, checking wounded, mourning dead, the victory tasting like ash and blood, but victory nonetheless. 2 warriors had fallen, young and old, both gone. The funeral that evening added their names to those spoken around fires. Ethan helped dig graves in the canyon's sacred ground, alongside brothers and sons and husbands who died 4 years ago. His hands blistered from the work, but he didn't stop until both women were laid to rest with honor they deserved. Isai treated his wounds with gentle efficiency. The bullet graze across his ribs was superficial, looked worse than it was. Naira sat beside him with a cut above her eye and split knuckles, both of them alive through luck as much as skill. That night she took his hand in the firelight, held it while her people watched and understood what it meant. "Today we proved something," she said to the assembled women. "Not that we can win through violence. We already knew violence. We proved we can protect what we've built. This canyon, this family, this life we've created from ashes of what was stolen from us." She looked directly at Ethan, her voice carrying across the fire. "We also proved that the family we choose can fight just as hard as the family we're born to. Today, A man who came here as our prisoner stood as our brother. And I think it's time we acknowledged what that means. She extended her hand to him. He took it, stood beside her, faced women who'd become his family through fire and blood and choice. Ethan Cross, Naira said formally, her words carrying weight of ritual. You came here tracking stolen horses. You stayed because you had nowhere else to go. But somewhere between being our captive and our defender, you became our family. And I want you to know that you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope. For a future that isn't just survival. Ethan's throat tightened with emotion. I came here ready to die. You taught me how to live again. All of you. He looked around the circle. Kaya, you showed me that broken people can still be whole enough to save each other. Amma, you showed me that strength doesn't have to mean hardness. Isi, you showed me that healing takes time and patience. He turned back to Naira, taking both her hands. And you showed me that loving again doesn't betray what I lost. Margaret and Lily will always be part of me, but they'd want me to have this, to have you, to have all of you. He pulled her close, rested his forehead against hers while women cheered and children clapped. I'm not asking to replace what you lost. I'm asking to build something new alongside you. If you'll have me. Naira kissed him while the camp celebrated, sealing a bond forged in shared grief and tested by fire. The frame shifted back to 1918, to the old man by the fire and the boy listening with rapt attention. Outside the Montana ranch house, wind still howled and snow still fell, but inside warmth filled the space between grandfather and grandson. So you married her? Thomas asked, eyes shining. I did, son. 6 months later, when we were sure the marshal wouldn't return. Ethan looked at the photograph on the mantle, at the woman who'd tested him and found him worthy. We had 40 years together, raised 3 daughters. Sarah, we named the first, after my Margaret. Then came Emma, for my Lily. And finally your grandmother, Naira's choice of name, Ayita. It means worker in her language, and that girl lived up to it. He smiled at the memory. All 3 grew strong and fierce like their mother. Married good men, built families. When the influenza took your parents 5 years back, Ayita brought you to us. She passed last spring. Heart just stopped one morning while she was tending her garden. Peaceful, like Naira went last winter with the pneumonia. His voice grew thick. But before Naira left, she made me promise something. To tell you this story, to make sure you understood that family isn't just blood, Thomas. It's the people who choose to stand beside you when everything falls apart. The people who see you broken and don't look away. Thomas moved closer to his grandfather, placed a small hand on the old man's weathered one. I'm glad too, Grandpa, because if you hadn't gone, I wouldn't be here. Ethan smiled, squeezing his grandson's hand. That's the thing about second chances, Thomas. Sometimes what looks like ending is really just beginning in disguise. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is admit he's broken and let someone see him anyway. Sometimes family isn't about blood, it's about who stands beside you when the wolves come howling. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and in the silence between them, the lessons of the past settled into the present like seeds planted for future harvest. Remember this, Ethan said, his voice carrying the weight of 78 years of loss and love and wisdom earned through living. Strength isn't about how much power you have, it's about how many times you choose not to use it. Any fool can take by force. A real man knows when to surrender, when to let himself be seen, when to choose vulnerability over violence. He looked at his grandson, seeing the future in the boy's eyes. And when you find people who see your broken places and don't turn away, who stand beside you when strangers come with threats, who teach you that home isn't a place but the people who make you remember why living matters. He smiled. You hold on to them. You protect them. You build something with them that lasts. Outside, the snow fell on Montana earth that had seen generations come and go. Inside, a grandfather passed wisdom to his grandson, keeping alive the story of how a broken man followed stolen horses into forbidden territory and found not death, but redemption. Not ending, but beginning. Not loss, but love that proved strong enough to survive anything, even the weight of ghosts that never fully fade. The carved wooden horse sat on the mantle beside Naira's photograph. worn smooth by decades of handling, a gift from a frightened girl to a man who'd chosen her life over his freedom, a reminder that some men could still be worth knowing, that broken people could heal each other, that family earned through choice was sometimes stronger than family born through blood. And as the fire burned low and Thomas's questions finally exhausted themselves into sleep, Ethan Cross sat in his rocking chair and remembered. Remembered the woman who'd tested him, the community that had accepted him, the life he'd built from ashes of the one that had burned. Remembered that sometimes the best things came not from seeking, but from being lost enough to accept help when it appeared, from being broken enough to let someone see the cracks, from being brave enough to stay when every instinct screamed to run. He closed his eyes and saw her face, not as it had been in the photograph, but as it had been that first night, studying him by firelight, deciding whether a man tied to a post deserved mercy or execution. Saw the moment she'd chosen to give him a chance, the moment that had changed everything. "Thank you," he whispered to the memory, to the ghost, to the love that had saved him when he'd stopped trying to save himself, for seeing me, for testing me, for letting me stay. And in the warmth of firelight, surrounded by the life he'd built and the family that continued his story, Ethan Cross finally understood what it meant to be home. Thomas stirred in his sleep on the rug, murmuring something soft and indistinct. Ethan reached down, pulled a wool blanket over the boy's shoulders with gnarled but gentle hands. The same hands that had once pulled bodies from ash, the same hands that had been bound to a post in a canyon, the same hands that had helped birth 3 daughters and built a life from ruins. Outside the window, the Montana snow continued its silent fall, covering the land in white that made everything look new again. Clean, full of possibility. Ethan looked at the photograph one more time. Naira's eyes seemed to meet his across the decades, holding that same challenge, that same recognition. "You were worth the risk," those eyes seemed to say. "You were worth saving." "And you saved me right back," he whispered to the woman who'd been gone less than a year, but felt present still in every corner of this house they'd built together. The fire crackled low, the clock on the mantel ticked steady, and Ethan Cross, who had once ridden into a canyon seeking death and found life instead, closed his eyes and let himself rest. Tomorrow he would wake. Tomorrow he would teach Thomas to mend a fence, to read a horse's ears, to understand that strength without gentleness was just violence waiting to happen. Tomorrow he would continue the work of passing on what he'd learned. But tonight he simply sat and remembered and was grateful. The carved wooden horse sat silent on the mantel beside Naira's photograph, worn smooth by 40 years of handling. A reminder that broken things could heal, that lost men could find their way home, that love, real love, was worth every scar it took to earn it. And as the fire burned down to embers and the night deepened around him, Ethan Cross smiled. He was home. He had always been home, and that was enough.